Puerto Rico's economy is in trouble, so much so that some are calling the island the Greece of the Caribbean. The country has no money to pay the $354 million debt it owes by December 1st. The government can't even pay its retirees' pensions. What's worse is that the island is getting no assistance from the mainland because the Obama administration's plan to help is getting no traction in a Republican-led Congress that does not want to restructure the Commonwealth's debt. It's a complex issue that some advocates say is getting very one-sided treatment in the mainstream U.S. media. Zyvis LeBron spoke to Baruch professor Hector Cordero Guzman about what can be done to help the island, including the possibility of ending its long-time affiliation with the U.S.
Professor, thanks so much for being on the show.
What a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
All right. So let's talk a little bit about Puerto Rico.
Sure.
Puerto Rico is at a crucial point in its history, in economics. Things look pretty bad. You know, some people are comparing it to what's been happening in Greece.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's try to talk briefly. Let's kind of set the scene for the audience, please.
Puerto Rico right now is facing a number of crises at the same time, which is what makes it look like a tsunami, if you will. First is the fiscal crisis. The government over the last 30, 40 years has been borrowing money to not only invest in productive activities, but also to cover previous debts and deficits. It's like borrowing from one credit card to pay another. See, one thing is borrowing from a credit card to pay tuition for an academic degree, and the other, if you want to make a parallel between countries and people, which is not always adequate.
Right, you're using a credit card to pay for another credit.
But to help people understand the challenge. It's sort of like the equivalent of getting credit to pay for older credit, and that's never considered fiscally good, and over the long term, it really causes what we know now as the fiscal crisis. $72 billion debt that if you look over the next 30 years, Puerto Rico would have to pay north of $150 billion to pay it back. Because when you borrow money, you just don't pay the exact amount back. That's the principle.
Pay interest, right.
You pay interest on that, and that's where the borrowers make their money. That's why they have an interest in that debt being fully repaid. That's the fiscal crisis. Underlying this fiscal crisis is an economic crisis. Puerto Rico's labor market and economy collapsed before the U.S. big recession around 2005, 2006. Employment went down significantly, and it really hasn't recovered. So the consumer base, the earning base, the tax-paying base has not had the income over the last few years to support the government to pay back its debts. It has led to a social crisis, which is evidenced by high levels of unemployment, still a poverty rate over 45%, over 50% for children in Puerto Rico, and an out-migration that is reaching historical levels and levels that haven't been seen. I think the estimate for last year was in the order of between 70 and 80,000 people left the island, which is, again, levels that weren't seen since the 40s, which is one of the ways in which the crisis in Puerto Rico connects to the U.S. And by now, there are about 3.5 million people in Puerto Rico and over 5 million in the U.S.
Right, right.
So there's more people in the U.S. side than on the island, many who are still connected and care a lot about the island, which is why we hear about this crisis a lot in the U.S.
Right. Now, you wrote a report, kind of analyzing the situation, and one of the things you mentioned in the report was that you said that what's happening in Puerto Rico still directly impacts people in the United States.
Yeah.
How so?
Puerto Rico is connected to the United States in a fundamental way. First of all, it is a territory of the United States, and the United States is in some ways responsible as the overseer, if you will, for the economic destiny of Puerto Rico. Number two, as I mentioned before, there are over 5 million Puerto Ricans in the U.S., in New York, in Florida, being the two largest polls, but also throughout New Jersey, Connecticut, Illinois, Texas. And this is a population of U.S. citizens, 3.5 million on the island, 5 million in the U.S., that are connected through family ties, through commercial ties, through economic ties, through cultural ties, through historical ties, through political ties. So Puerto Rico is not some far off over there place. Puerto Rico is very much a part of the U.S., or as the Supreme Court famously ruled ones, it belongs to the United States, but it's not a part of the United States. So that basically creates a set of connections that are really important, which are some of the ones that we try to emphasize in the report.
One of the things kind of coming out of the report, and one of the issues that's kind of being discussed right now, is this very notion of ending that long-term relationship with the United States as part of an effort to alleviate Puerto Rico's crisis. How is that going to work?
Well, I mean, there are historically been three large or three views about Puerto Rico's relationship to the United States. On the one hand, there's a statehood movement, a group of people that believe that the solution to Puerto Rico's political and by consequence other types of problems is in becoming the 51st or 52nd, depending on whether some other territory gets there first, or becoming a state of the United States.
Right.
And what they see as full senatorial, congressional participation in the states. And there are some in Puerto Rico that believe the Commonwealth status that we have now is quote unquote the best of both worlds, as U.S. citizenship and many of the protections of the U.S. without being fully subsumed, if you will, under U.S. law. And then historically, there's been a vibrant independence movement that sees that the best outcome for Puerto Rico is by becoming an independent nation, like many other Caribbean, Central American, and South American nations.
Yeah, but even that comes with its own set of issues. But
every one of these options has challenges, right? We now know that this Commonwealth status, which was presented as the best of both worlds and may have been in the 50s, is certainly not the best of both worlds in 2015. Because you have a very large group of people, 3.5 million U.S. citizens, like many others, who don't have really full representation. And there's something that strikes us 100 years ago, many, but in 2015, a vast majority of people as fundamentally unfair and undemocratic. So this crisis presents an opportunity to also have to address the broader kind of political status question for Puerto Rico. But the challenge is that decision isn't only Puerto Rico's. This is a negotiation in a way between two peoples. So we need to know from the U.S. side, what is the U.S. willing to put on the table? If this is a negotiation, what is being negotiated, right?
Now,
what kind of independence, what kind of statehood?
Now, is that on the table? I'm sorry, I don't mean to cut you off, but is that on the table at all with the U.S. government?
Right now, the U.S. government's official position is Puerto Rico can do a plebiscite, and its people can decide what option they want. And in the last plebiscites that have happened, the Commonwealth and the statehood party have been fairly even. Historical record from Alaska and others suggest that majorities of 50, 60%, what they call super majorities, may be needed. So there's a view in Congress that Puerto Rico needs to really affirm that it wants statehood repeated times with majorities. And politically on the island, that's not necessarily going to, not in the cards right now. So that is the impasse that we see now that leaves Puerto Rico with this kind of amorphous status, because there's no consensus that in the U.S., certainly, and in Puerto Rico, that in a set of forces that can bring everyone to the table to say, we need to decide how to change it and change it, right?
Okay. One of the things that has kind of come out of this whole situation in Puerto Rico is a sense of a disparity between what's being covered here in the U.S., what's being produced by local media, and what's being produced by Puerto Rican media. One of the things, I'm going to quote something from a recent New York Times article that wrote, some of the island's creditors have been insisting from the sidelines that the island's financial health is really not as dire as portrayed, and that predictions of a collapse are overdrawn, meant to provide political cover for a government that can't get its act together well enough to pay its bondholders.
Sure.
Now that's kind of definitely leaning in a particular direction.
Sure.
Do you see that disparity in the coverage between the different media?
Certainly Puerto Rico is a drama that has a number of actors involved in it. One is the bondholders, those that lend to Puerto Rico. And they lend to Puerto Rico a certain amount of money expecting to be paid in full and thinking, it's a U.S. flag that's flying. I get triple tax exemption, and there's a constitution that guarantees that I'll get paid, and they don't have access to bankruptcy. So what they thought was a sure investment, and they want it back. On the other hand is the government of Puerto Rico that is looking at its finances and saying, this amount of debt is impossible for us to pay it all back. We need to sit down on the table and renegotiate. Both, in a way, are right about each other's flaws. The bondholders are correct that Puerto Rico's government and the way it managed its finances and its programs wasn't necessarily optimal. But as lenders, they should have done their due diligence and pushed the envelope maybe before we got to this point. The government's also perhaps correct that doesn't have the full resources to maintain services at the level that it needs to and pay the bondholders. Bondholders say, well, but the government does a lot that it doesn't need to do. There's a lot of fat, there's a lot of excess. And certainly there's no evidence that Puerto Rico's government is overfunded. There's evidence that it's mismanaged. And there may be a point where many can intervene and say, let's make sure that every single resource, whether federal or local, that goes into the government is used well. In the end, sadly, the victims of this bickering between the government and the bondholders are the people of Puerto Rico and ultimately the poorer people of Puerto Rico that are now seeing their pockets picked by everyone through increasing taxes, reduction in services, the doubling, for example, of the fee that you have to pay to register your car every year. And those are things that hit the pocket of the smaller people.
Yeah, so the
Puerto Rico
everyman
needs to make its tax collection fairer and collect more from those that make the most and less from those that make the least. In Puerto Rico right now, the bottom 20% of the population makes 1% of the income pie, whereas the top 5% of the population makes 25% of the income pie, and the top 20% of the population makes 55% of the income pie. So there's an uneven distribution of the wealth in Puerto Rico, which needs to be balanced with fairer taxation so that everyone can then come afloat. Right now, I think bondholders to some extent are right that the Puerto Rico government can be more effective. And the Puerto Rico government is right that as things stand today and given the needs of the country in a recession, it doesn't have the resources to pay back, which is why in the report we recommend that we need an entity like the federal government to take a stand, bring everyone together, and ensure that there is some kind of a fairer adjudication of this challenge and that there's not a finger put on the scale on the favor of one side, say the bondholders, or really that the Puerto Rican government is not held accountable for what it needs to be held accountable for.
This is just going to be the one last question because they're yelling at me to end. You mentioned the fact that the federal government needs to come up with a plan. Is there any, like opening at the end of the light at the end of the tunnel that says that the federal government's going to do something to help Puerto Rico?
It's the perfect storm in the sense that the timing is horrible. With an election year coming up, a divided presidency, House, Senate, that have been at each other's throats for the last 6-7 years, there doesn't appear to be consensus or a way to bring people together in the federal government either. So Puerto Rico and its stakeholders are divided. The federal government and its stakeholders are divided. And again, tragically, the victims of this are the people of Puerto Rico, which is why in our report we ask everyone to make sure that they put differences aside and without more pain, that they ensure that a solution is found. Because otherwise, again, who's going to suffer is those that can afford it the least.
Right. That goes back to that old saying, a house divided cannot stand, right?
Absolutely.
All right.
Collapse on itself.
All right.
And we'll bring that to ourselves if we don't get it together.
All right, Professor. Thank you very much for your time today.
It's a pleasure. So thanks for the time. Appreciate it.